So we don't endorse candidates, we don't endorse parties, and as you're going to hear, we are critical of Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. What we do have is this consistent minimalist view about the proper role of government. So conservatives agree with us on some issues, liberals on others, and as you all know, the conservatives agree with us on domestic, regulatory, economic, fiscal, budget, tax, those kinds of issues. Liberals on issues like a more liberalized immigration policy, drug legalization, a right to same-sex marriage, non-interventionist foreign policy. So is it an indication of libertarian inconsistency that we agree with liberals sometimes and conservatives sometimes? It isn't, of course. It's an indication that liberals and conservatives are philosophically inconsistent. And to illustrate that, I want to suggest to you that one way of looking at the U.S. Constitution, or for that matter, looking at our whole system of government, is to focus on the last two provisions of the Bill of Rights, part of which was covered by Roger, the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendment. Of course, the 10th Amendment tells us that the federal government can only exercise certain powers that are listed in the Constitution, and the amendment goes on to say if the power isn't enumerated, if it isn't delegated to the national government, then it's reserved to the states, or depending on the provisions of state law, reserved directly to the people. So we have these express powers in Article 1, Section 8, 18 powers, things like power to coin money, declare war, regulate interstate commerce, create postal offices, et cetera. Now, libertarians and conservatives agree generally on this very tightly constrained view of federal powers, but there are a couple of key exceptions. One key exception is that conservatives, but not libertarians, are willing to federalize, and by that, of course, I mean assign responsibility to the federal government, a significant amount of both criminal law and civil law. If you want an example in the criminal law area, take a look at our totally feckless and futile war on drugs, for which there's no constitutional authority. There are only a couple of crimes that are mentioned in the Constitution, piracy and counterfeiting and treason. Beyond that, criminal law has been a state and local matter. But because conservatives believe that the war on drugs is very important to prosecute, they're willing to overlook the fact that there is no constitutional authority for prosecuting the war on drugs. If you want an example in the civil law area, take a look at the outcry during the Obamacare debates for malpractice reform. Now, it may very well be that malpractice reform is a very important thing to do. I happen to think it is. But the question that libertarians ask is, where in the Constitution is there authority for the federal government to get involved in malpractice reform? And if you ask the conservative, he says it's a regulation of interstate commerce, the very same logic that the Obama administration advanced with respect to the constitutionality of Obamacare. If you know anything about malpractice, you know typically it's a patient living in a state that's suing a doctor that lives in the same state about an injury that occurred in the state where both of them live. So it's very difficult to imagine that morphing into a regulation of interstate commerce, and yet conservatives are willing to overlook that fact because they believe that malpractice reform is a very important thing to see come to pass. So right now we have the federal government immersed in all sorts of matters that are not authorized by the Constitution, and that extends to everything from public schools to hurricane relief, to our welfare system, our retirement system, medical care, family planning, even aid to the arts. See if you can find aid to the arts anywhere. Imagine it anywhere fitting within one of Congress's authorized powers. So that's one area of difference between conservatives and libertarians. Another area in the powers area is that conservatives are much less anxious than libertarians about concentrating an awful lot of power in the executive branch, particularly in this post-9/11 trade-off between national security and civil liberties. Libertarians remind their conservative friends that too much unchecked authority in one branch of government threatens the notion of separation of powers, which has been a cornerstone of the Constitution for 2¼ centuries. So the administration, and I'm sorry to say, I mean most particularly the George W. Bush administration, may not all by itself set the rules, because that's not an executive function, that's a legislative function. And while the administration may prosecute infractions, the administration may not, after the fact, determine guilt or innocence, much less may the administration determine whether its own activities have comported with the dictates of the Constitution, because that is not an executive function, that is a judicial function. So that's the powers of government perspective, sort of grounded on the 10th Amendment and the separation of powers doctrine. Now, I also mentioned another amendment, the Ninth Amendment, that Roger mentioned as well, addresses not powers but rights. And what it says to us is that the listing of certain rights in the Constitution doesn't mean that those are all the rights that we have. We have all kinds of rights that existed before the Constitution was written, even before the government was formed. And as Roger pointed out, the Ninth Amendment uses the word retain. You can't retain what you didn't already have. Now, this provision in the Ninth Amendment, this focus on all of these rights that we have, this imposes another powerful discipline on federal behavior, because what it means is that even if the federal government complies with the 10th Amendment and only exercises the powers that are enumerated in the Constitution, the Ninth Amendment instructs that even that limited list of powers cannot be exercised in a manner which violates our rights. And if you want to know which rights can't be violated, the Ninth Amendment instructs that it's not just the rights that are laid out in the Bill of Rights, speech, religion, freedom from unreasonable searches and the like. It's those rights, to be sure, but it's also the very, very long list of unenumerated rights, which in the libertarian view would include, for example, the right to gamble, or for that matter, the right to smoke marijuana. Now, notice that the presumptions in the Ninth and Tenth Amendment are exactly opposite one another. If you capture that, if you understand that, then you understand the entire structure of the federal system. The Tenth Amendment says if the power isn't there, the government doesn't have it. The Ninth Amendment is just the reverse. If the right isn't there, that doesn't mean that we don't have it. We have this long, long list of rights predating the Constitution, predating the formation of the U.S. government. So if you wanted to identify a single constitutional provision that most distinguishes the libertarians from conservatives, it would probably be the Ninth Amendment. The conservatives treat the Ninth Amendment, and here I use a term coined by former Judge Robert Bork, as an ink blot. He said the Ninth Amendment should be ignored. Nobody knows what it means. It's as if somebody spilled ink on the portion of the amendment that would have identified all of these unenumerated rights that the libertarians tell us we have. Well, the libertarians don't treat the Ninth Amendment as an ink blot. They treat it as if it means something.